Hello, everyone. I'm Mio Stevens-Gandara, Assistant Professor of Photography and current organizer for cultural events at Rio Hondo College. The Cultural Events program at Rio Hondo College presents a diverse selection of arts and entertainment free of charge for our community. Rio Hondo's Cultural Events program showcases the visual and performing arts work of students and faculty, as well as regional, national, and international artists. We continue tonight with our programming that focuses on three categories: honoring ancestors, preserving culture for future generations, and youth and community empowerment. If we should have any technical difficulties tonight, please be patient. We'll work it out. If you have any questions, please post them and we will answer at the end of the talk. Tonight, we are excited to have Chef Jocelyn Ramirez with us. Chef Jocelyn Ramirez founded TODO Verde in 2015 with a mission to create delicious and healthy plant-based food inspired by her Mexican and South American roots for the East Side community. Jocelyn also co-founded Across Our Kitchen Tables, an organization focused on uplifting women of color in the food industry. She currently sits on the Culinary Advisory Board for Food Forward and the Leadership Board for the Los Angeles Food Policy Council. Her cookbook, La Vida Verde, Plant-Based Mexican Cooking with Authentic Flavor, was published earlier this year. Welcome, Jocelyn. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mio. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm excited to get cooking with everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and for everyone who's joining. I'm excited to cook with you. I'm not sure how many folks are cooking along as we are going through our program today, but if you have any questions and you are cooking, please make sure to include them in the comments as mentioned, and I'll make sure to come back to you and help out in any way if you need it right then and there. But before we get started with the actual cooking, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the recipe that we're going to be making and why it's so important and impactful to the work that I do. This recipe today is a jackfruit carnitas recipe that is going to be topped over a plant-based nacho cheese that is going to assemble a nacho plate. And for me, I feel like this dish is really fun and exciting, especially for folks at the college level, because who doesn't love nachos, right? I think that it brings back all the nostalgic, textures, flavors, and also this cultural reference that I think is so important to not be lost when we're talking about plant-based food. So back before I became plant-based, or as I was transitioning at the very beginning of becoming plant-based, a lot of folks would say, if you're considering plant-based or eating that way, you're essentially losing your culture. How could you be Mexican and not eat meat? And so I'm here to challenge that and say that we can still be able to eat all the things that we love. Maybe not all, but a lot of the things that we love, and still really give it this flavor that will make you keep reaching for more. So I'll keep talking a little bit about that as we transition along, but I want to get started with the recipe. And I do want to note that there is a second screen that's going to be coming up in just a second here that will have my stovetop. And so you'll be able to see what I'm cooking in real time here in that second shot, which should be coming up now. So let's get cooking here. And I have already started to prepare a couple of things just to make sure that we have enough time. If you are cooking along, I will give you a heads up that I have here my roughly chopped potatoes and carrots for our nacho cheese that have already started to come to not even a simmer yet. I literally just turned this on just to give us a little bit of a head start so that we're not trying to watch water boil. And it's 3 russet potatoes, which we've all had russet potatoes before. We know what they look like, right? So russet potatoes that are roughly chopped. I have 1 medium carrot roughly chopped here, just pretty much sliced up. And I just have some salted water. So I added enough water to make sure that I'm coating the potatoes and carrots. Turn your stove on to about medium heat. Right now I have it pretty low because I, again, wanted to just get a little bit of that head start. And let this come to a simmer until your potatoes and carrots are about fork tender. And I, as you can see, like to leave the skin on the potatoes. I think it's perfectly fine to leave the skin on. A lot of people like to peel the potatoes. That's totally fine. If you have a high power blender like the one that I'm using today, which is a Vitamix, then you'll see that your cheese will come out fairly smooth. But if you don't have a high power blender, you might see little pieces of the potato skin throughout your nacho cheese. So if that's not the vibe you're going for, you can definitely peel them. But I still think it's perfectly fine to include skin on. And again, just enough water to cover them. A nice amount of salt. Let me add actually a little bit of salt here. I'm not sure how much salt I added. I can't remember if I added salt before here. So adding a good amount of salt there, just to infuse some of that flavor into the potatoes and carrots. And I'll let this do its thing for a few more minutes as we transition to my cutting board here. And I want to talk a little bit about jackfruit. So jackfruit is something that is not new. It's been around for a long, long time, but it's new to a lot of people in that we haven't really cooked with it very much. Jackfruit is essentially a big fruit that grows on trees that looks a lot like a huge watermelon with green spikes all over the outside. And it's a really delicious tropical fruit, typically grown in Asian countries and in Mexico. And when you eat it sweet, it's super unique in flavor, almost a cross between like a papaya, a pineapple, and a mango. It has a delicious tropical flavor. But if you cut into a jackfruit before it ripens, before it becomes a super sweet, delicious fruit, you have what we call here young green jackfruit. And so you can see that it's pretty pale in color. It has a little hint of green in it. And you will typically find it canned or jarred, sometimes in a pouch at your health food store. It's becoming more and more readily available at other stores too, not just health food stores. And if you live near an Asian market, you can definitely find a canned young green jackfruit available there. And so when you open up that can or the pouch or if it's in a brine, essentially if it's in a liquid, you're going to see that, just a little gentle squeeze will start to, pull some of that liquid out. And that's essentially what you want to do. You want to open up the can or the jar and strain it. And then you want to get all that brine out. And then you want to give it a really good rinse. And you'll use your hands to squeeze out that liquid. So I'm going to pan down so you can see my cutting board. And all I like to do here is just grab a few pieces of jackfruit. And I just use my hands to just gently squeeze all of that liquid out. You can see all the liquid that's being removed. These are just a few pieces that I reserved. I already got a little bit of a head start with my jackfruit, but I wanted to make sure that I demonstrate how I like to break it down. So if you may have seen, some quick videos out there, quick tutorials on how to break down jackfruit, I've seen a bunch, and sometimes I've seen folks who just literally open up the can of jackfruit, they drain out the liquid, and then they just throw the big old chunks of jackfruit directly in their pan. And I'm going to show you a couple of extra steps before you throw it in the pan, which I think are pretty important to make sure that you have this like really delicious and also meaty texture to your jackfruit. So check out all this liquid that I pulled out. You definitely want to get rid of all that liquid because that's going to alter your flavor. It's going to be kind of watered down if you don't get rid of all that. So the squeezing part is super important. I'm going to go ahead and remove this bowl. And then I'm going to break down this jackfruit. So one thing you'll see here is that the jackfruit is in this triangular shape, and the bottom part of the jackfruit is what I call the core. This is a piece that kind of holds this top portion together. And this top portion, as you can see, when I apply a little bit of pressure on it, it shreds really easily, and it has almost this like shredded chicken, shredded pork texture, which is why a lot of people love jackfruit, because it has the texture that we want in sort of like a meat-like or meat substitute. And this core section doesn't shred. So if I apply pressure, it's a little bit tender, but it's a little bit more tough, and I can't shred it. So I still like to eat this part of the jackfruit because it tastes just like the other parts of it. It's just more of a textural thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring my jackfruit to my cutting board and cut where I see that line that connects the core to the top part of the jackfruit. And so, obviously, like I mentioned, it's important to break this down a bit further because it's a big old chunk and it doesn't really look like meat. So it's a very much a textural thing that you want to break down so that it starts to kind of continue to look and emulate a meat alternative. And then the other thing is for flavor purposes, if I were to season and coat and sear this piece of jackfruit that I just dropped, here we go. It'll taste really good on the outside, but when I bite into it, it's going to be really bland. So think about tofu, for example. Like, people flavor the outside of tofu, but then when you bite into the inside, it still tastes like pretty plain tofu. So I like to break that up to make sure that I'm getting a super flavorful dish. And then the other thing that I'll note here is for these I call them shreddy or shreddable pieces of jackfruit. You sometimes will find these like little seed pods. This one has little tiny ones, which are fine, but sometimes you'll find slightly larger ones. And again, this is more of a textural thing. If you were to present this dish to friends or family, and it has all these big seed pods in them and these big triangular shapes, it doesn't really quite look like meat. It looks a bit odd. So I want to make sure that I break everything down until it really starts to take on the look of meat. So I'm going to keep going through and finding that line where my core and my shreddable pieces of jackfruit connect. And I'm going to create a couple different piles here. So here you can see a big old seed pod. So I want to make sure that this goes in the same pile as my seeds and my core that I'm kind of setting aside, that I'll end up mincing with a knife, or if you have a food processor, you can definitely use a food processor to break it down. And so I'm just checking with my other hand if there's any big old seeds in the top portion of the jackfruit, and just moving the pieces that need to be broken down to their pile. So this pile here is like jackfruit ready to go. And I'm creating another little pile over here that's jackfruit that still has yet to, that needs to be minced up. And I really love jackfruit. I know that there's like a lot of meat alternatives out there. We're seeing a lot of the Impossible and the Beyond, and I think that to a certain extent they're pretty great because I think they're giving people an opportunity to explore plant-based food that feels pretty close to the actual thing that they were eating before. But what I like about jackfruit is that it's relatively unprocessed, aside from the fact that it's cut from a tree. They break it down when it's still young green jackfruit, and then they put it in a brine to preserve it, and that's essentially it. So it doesn't have this a little bit of science created to help preserve it and create it or make it into something else completely, which is essentially what some of these plant-based meats are. So that's why I really love jackfruit, is because that you're essentially just eating a fruit that's underripe. So this jackfruit that's ready to go, I'm going to add it to a bowl of jackfruit that I've already pre-minced up. So I'm using here 3 cans of jackfruit. You all got the list of ingredients. I essentially went through most of that jackfruit already, and I went ahead and shredded the top pieces a little bit, and then I minced up the cores, which is what I'm going to do with these pieces that I have reserved here on my cutting board. So again, if you have a food processor, you can definitely use a food processor. It'll be a little bit faster. If you don't, just a good old cutting board and knife will do the trick. I recommend a chef's knife, which is a larger blade. Maybe one that rocks forward and back will make your life a little bit easier, so that your fingers don't have to get involved with holding on to the pieces of jackfruit. You can just bring your hand to the top of the blade and just run your knife through it. And so essentially all I'm trying to do, it's not like a perfect, slice or dice. I'm just using my knife to mince this jackfruit until it starts to break down a little bit, until the bigger pieces don't feel as big, until I start to see that the jackfruit feels like it can kind of blend into the shreddable bits of jackfruit that has a texture that we like. And again, I've seen so many people throw these bits away. They throw away the seed pods, they throw away the cores because they don't like the way it looks in their jackfruit. But that's essentially just food waste. So really take the extra time to just break this down. If you want to make sure that you're eating every little last bite of the jackfruit you bought for yourself, and that you also get that nice texture that we want in this dish. So as you can see, that was pretty quick. I went ahead and just minced this all up, and then I'm going to add this jackfruit to my bowl of jackfruit that's ready to go. And so this dish, as I mentioned, is a carnitas dish. You can use jackfruit for a variety of different things. I've used jackfruit for everything from pozole, a tuna salad, to al pastor, to tostadas. You can use it for so many different recipes. It's a really, really versatile ingredient, which is why I love it so much. And it has such a neutral flavor that all you need to do is, in any way you end up using the jackfruit, you want to go through these steps of like squeezing out the liquid, separating the cores and the seeds, and then mincing them up. And you're going to have a really, really great textured dish. And you can see here that my jackfruit doesn't look as wet and moist as it did earlier. It's definitely kind of dried out a little bit, which is what I want, because I want my seasoning and my flavor to really infuse this jackfruit. And the last thing that I'm doing here is I'm just using my hands to just break up any large pieces of the jackfruit, the shreddy pieces of jackfruit that haven't been broken down yet, just to, again, get my seasoning infused all throughout every little last bite of jackfruit. And so that I don't have any pieces that don't taste super great, and that it's also giving me that texture that I'm looking for, which is a shredded pork, shredded chicken style of texture. So once I finish doing this, I'm going to season my jackfruit in the bowl here, and I'm going to start getting that process cooking. And I really love fooling people. I was like trying to think of a better word, but I mean, it's been so cool to serve this jackfruit at different events, at family gatherings, and people to be like, oh, I'm not eating meat right now, or I gave up meat, or I'm vegetarian, so I'll take everything you have except for that meat dish you have there. And they're talking about jackfruit, you guys. So I think it's a really, really cool, versatile dish that is really starting to like take the market by storm and really getting people excited about plant-based. I'm going to give my hands a quick rinse, and then I'm going to get my seasoning going. My potatoes and carrots are slowly simmering. So as soon as we get this jackfruit cooking, I'm going to turn back to my potatoes and carrots for my nacho cheese. So for this jackfruit, what I like to use is really, really simple. It's things that you probably already have in your pantry. And believe me, this is just a base. You can take it to so many more flavorful layers beyond this. And I can share a little bit about other things that I like to infuse into my jackfruit to make it even more delicious. But what I'm using here for dry seasoning, again, this is 3 cans of young green jackfruit, and I have 2 tablespoons of just dried cumin. And this is going to give me a nice bit of depth of flavor. It's also going to give me a little bit of a just, kind of like a smoky, deep, rich note in the background. And then I have a tablespoon of dried Mexican oregano. If you have Italian oregano, that'll work just fine. And this is definitely going to give me this nice earthy feel to the dish. And then I have here's some, let me double check my measurements here. I have my book right in front of me, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. I have a half teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes, which is just going to give it a little kick. You can definitely add more if you like spicy food. If you don't love spicy food, you can leave it out. It'll be perfectly fine. If you have dried chile de árbol, even better. And I just have a little pinch of freshly ground black pepper. So I'm just going to sprinkle my spices over the top of my jackfruit. And then I'm also going to add salt, and I'm going to add salt to taste. And remember that this is a fruit, so you can taste it when it's still raw once we mix everything together, and you can feel if it needs a bit more salt. I'm going to add a few pinches. This is just kosher salt I have, but salt depends on you. You may have some saltier table salt. You might have some pink Himalayan salt that's not as salty. So really the salt depends on what type of salt you're using at home and how much of it you use. And I'm going to also add some orange juice. So I have a fresh orange. It's a pretty large orange. I'm going to start with adding half of my orange. And I'm just going to literally squeeze the juice out of this orange into my bowl of jackfruit. And the other half I'm going to reserve as it's cooking. So what the orange juice is going to do here is it's going to give it a little bit of sweetness, which is nice. So it'll give it a little bit of depth of flavor. It's also, because it has sugars in it, going to also help caramelize the jackfruit, which means it's going to help brown it slightly, which is really, really nice and important here. And the last thing that I'll add for this dish is I have 3/4 cups of cooking oil. I like to use grapeseed oil for cooking at home. If you have regular olive oil, avocado oil, you can use pretty much any oil that you typically use for cooking. I typically don't cook with extra virgin olive oil. That's more for finishing dishes or salad dressings and things like that. But you want to choose an oil that has a higher smoke point, which means that it's not going to burn super easily, because this is going to cook for about 25 minutes or so. And I'm not going to add all 3/4 cups right now. I'm going to add about half of this amount, and as needed while cooking, and I'll show you what that looks like, I'll add a little bit more. And it really depends on like if my jackfruit is looking a bit dry or not. So I'll keep an eye and I'll show you what I'm talking about if I get there. And sometimes it depends on your cooking surface. Like, I'm using a porous cast iron, which you'll see in a moment. If you're, and that one I feel sometimes could use a bit more oil. If you're using something like stainless steel, you might find that you're kind of like sticking to your pan a little bit, and you might, need a bit more oil or not. So it really depends. But you can start off with about half of that portion amount, and then we can add more as needed as it looks like it's maybe starting to dry out. And I'll just simply mix all these ingredients together until I make sure that it's all coated my jackfruit really nicely and that it's seasoned pretty well. And I mentioned earlier that you can definitely keep adding to this. So if you have a little bit of liquid aminos, if you have mushroom powder, if you have nutritional yeast, which you should have because we're making the nachos and that's one of the ingredients, you can add a little bit of all these different flavor profiles to this dish, and it's only going to start to, continue to deepen the flavor. I really love cooking with mushrooms, so I use a lot of mushroom powder, mushroom paste. You can use tamari. You can use, several different things to, continue to deepen the flavor. And also, one flavor that I like to use as sort of like a trick up my sleeve is hickory liquid smoke, which I'm not going to use right now, but this is a game changer. You can add a few drops of liquid smoke in here, and literally a little bit goes a long way. Like just a couple drops will make all the difference, and will start to give you a little bit of that smoky, like outdoor grill flavor. So now that I see my jackfruit's pretty well incorporated here and that my seasoning is all distributed throughout, I'm going to add my jackfruit to a preheated cast iron skillet that I have on my stove. So I'm going to transition back to my stove for the next few minutes. And my cast iron is just on a medium-low heat. And all I'm going to do is just simply toss my jackfruit in here. And I can hear a little bit of sizzling. And I just had it preheating. on like a medium low heat. And you want to keep it at about medium as it's cooking, because if you turn up your heat too high, you will likely start to char or burn your jackfruit a little bit. Although I will say that jackfruit's a pretty resilient ingredient, and that it's pretty hard to just like ruin it right away. Like even if you have a little bit of blackening, you can mix that back in and keep cooking it, and it just somehow magically kind of fixes itself. I don't know how to explain it. But you can always add more moisture too. Like if you see that it's drying, which is mostly what jackfruit does, is it's starting to sometimes like overcook. Is like it'll essentially look dry. And so right now I could see a little bit of shimmer on my jackfruit because of the oil and the orange juice. But if I start to look at my jackfruit and see that it's starting to look kind of sad and dry and not really crisping up, that's when I'll hit it with a little bit more of my oil, and I'll hit it with a little bit more of my orange juice. So all I essentially want to do is keep coming back to my jackfruit every now and then. And I want to just make sure that I'm turning it so that the jackfruit that's on the bottom of the pan is being distributed back to the top of the pan, and vice versa, just making sure that it's cooking evenly. And I don't need to super babysit this jackfruit in that I can walk away, but not too long again. So you want to make sure that you don't burn it. And this is on, again, medium heat. And as you can see here on the front burner, I have my potatoes and carrots that have been cooking for a little bit in the simmer. And essentially all I want to do is I want to grab a fork, and I want to make sure that it's fork tender. And if you've never checked out anything that's fork tender, essentially what it is it's making sure that it's like soft enough for a fork to easily pierce through, and that it's not still like a hard piece of carrot, a hard piece of potato. Sometimes I like to see like the potatoes kind of starting to break up a little bit into smaller pieces. That way I really, really know that it's cooked through. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat on my front burner. And what I'm going to do is start working on my nacho cheese. But before I start pulling this out, I'm going to give it just like a minute or two to cool. And I'm going to talk about the other ingredients that are going to go in this dish. So I'm going to transition back to my laptop. And the other ingredients are really, really relatively easy to find. But once you start working with them, you can use them in so many different ways. So the first one here is cashews. And so we've all seen cashew nuts. They're probably like the nuts you see at the grocery store, and you're like, I haven't been the hugest fan of cashews, but now that I can use them in the way that I use them now, in like creams, cheeses and sauces and things like that, they're definitely a game changer. And I think I didn't like them before, mostly because they're, for me, kind of like this bland nut, like the cashew nuts are not the most vibrant, outstanding nut out there. And so they're great for these dishes because essentially the cashews are serving as a texture, as a base. And so what I have here is 1 cup of raw cashew pieces. I like to use raw cashews versus toasted because obviously toasted cashews are going to give your dish a slightly toasted flavor. And so I like to use raw so it's even more neutral. And then I buy pieces versus whole fancy cashews and they literally are called whole fancy, because those are more expensive. And I'm going to blend these up to become a sauce. So no need buying the whole fancy pieces. I can use little bits and pieces that I soak. So this is 1 cup of cashews. I've been just soaking them in regular water or room temperature water for about an hour, maybe hour and a half. If you're using a high power blender like my Vitamix that I'm going to use in a few minutes, you want to soak them for at least 30 minutes. If you're in a pinch, you can throw them in some hot water and that'll help kind of rehydrate them a little bit. But if you are using a blender that's not high power, you can soak your cashews in hot water, warm water for 2 hours or overnight. And that's definitely going to make sure that you have like a really, really smooth sauce. And the water that they're soaking in, I'm not going to use them in the recipe. So right now I'll take them over to my sink and I'll strain them out. So I just want the rehydrated cashews, but not the water that they're soaking in. And the other main ingredient here is the nutritional yeast. So nutritional yeast is this sort of flaky, exactly what it sounds like. It's a yeast. And you can find it in a fine powder and flakes. And essentially what it is it's a cheesy, funky yeast. When you smell it, it has a, you know, a cheesy kind of almost fermented feel to it. And that's what's going to make this dish feel a bit cheesy in the flavor profile. So the cashews are more of this smooth texture. The nutritional yeast is going to be this cheesy goodness. The potatoes are like the starchy kind of what brings it all together. And the carrots, or actually the one carrot, is actually just mainly color. It's going to give a little bit of sweetness, but it's going to give the cheese its like orangey, yellowy, orangey hue that we all know and love from nacho cheese. So I'm going to go back to my stove. I'm going to check on my jackfruit. And you can see here that I'm starting to get this nice browning on my jackfruit. So check that out. It looks great. So I just want to make sure that I'm checking on it from time to time, giving it a nice mix, and making sure that I'm cooking it evenly. And mine still looks like it has enough liquid in there, enough oil, enough orange juice. So I'll let it be for a little while longer and let it keep cooking and see if I need to add some in a little bit. And then for these potatoes and carrots, I'm going to use a slotted spoon just to pull all the potatoes and carrots out of this pot. And you can blend in 1 or 2 batches. It's up to you and how big your blender is and how powerful your blender is. I'm going to blend in 1 batch and hope for the best here. Sometimes my blender struggles a little bit, but it should be fine. And I'm also going to use 1 cup of this starchy liquid. So the salted water that we used, it's an important element. So don't toss it. We want to use that water to help us blend the potatoes and carrots. And it has like that nice starchiness out of the potatoes and carrots that we need to kind of pull the whole dish together. So I'll reserve 1 cup of that after I finish pulling out all these potatoes and carrots. And this cheese is actually, it's pretty funny because I've been testing this cheese for a while. It's now one of the dishes that's in my cookbook, La Vida Verde, in nachos. And the first time I ever made it for my family, I had already made it before, but it was probably for maybe like the Thanksgiving holiday or something like that. And my brother walked into the kitchen. He's like, I heard you're making mac and cheese. And I was like, yeah, I'm making mac and cheese right now. And he's like, I thought you're vegan. Like, how are you making mac and cheese? And I was like, well, dude, it's vegan mac and cheese. And he was like, and mind you, like I've been cooking for my family for a long time. Usually they love most things, but this one was like, I had gone too far. He was really upset about it. He's like, why do you always have to do this? Like, can't we just have our regular mac and cheese? Like, we don't need to have this vegan version. And he was so upset. And by the end of the night, he actually ended up eating 3 plates of that mac and cheese. He loved it that much. So that was a shocker for me. I knew that I had to keep working on this recipe and making it just right for folks. And also, it's so easy, everyone. Like, once you see how quickly it blends together, you're just going to be shocked at why you weren't eating this nacho cheese a long time ago. And a lot of the nacho cheese that we see at restaurants, sadly, especially because I work in the restaurant world, I know this, is like really gross canned cheese. So hopefully you love this cheese and you can make it, recreate it anytime you're craving that nacho cheese flavor. So I'm back at my cutting board. I have all my potatoes and carrots in my blender. I'm going to add my 1/4 cup of nutritional yeast. And I'm also going to add my 1 cup of rehydrated or soaked and drained cashews. So none of that water from the cashews, just the cashews themselves. And I'm also going to add 1 cup of my starchy liquid from my pot. I'm going to just grab the pot and gently pour. You find the best way for you, so make sure you don't burn yourself, but I'm just going to do this into a measuring cup. And you may need more, so don't toss the liquid just yet. When I say like 1 medium carrot and 3 medium potatoes, I mean, your potatoes might be slightly larger, slightly smaller, so you can kind of gauge and see once it's blending if you need more liquid, and you're going to pull from that same liquid. And the last thing is salt. So again, salt to taste, but I will say that this nacho cheese should be slightly salty. Otherwise, it's going to taste like a potato and carrot stew. You need that little kick of the salt, and cheese is salty. So, most recipes, when they call for cheese, they'll say, oh, don't add too much salt because you have all this cheese in there. So same thing goes. You want to make sure that you give it just the right amount of salt where you kind of are able to not feel the potatoes and carrots being the prominent part of the dish, that they're kind of like blended into this dish that kind of sings a bit better. So I'm going to add a couple pinches, and then I'll taste and see if I need more. And I'll bring this over to my Vitamix and start blending. And you want to be really careful if this is still really hot. My Vitamix does have this tamper, which is going to help me push down the ingredients. If you don't have this, what you could do is stop your blender about halfway through, and you can use a spatula to scrape down the sides, and then take the spatula out, cover it, and then blend again. The other thing is this is also hot. So if you have a blender that has that plastic covering here, make sure that there's air coming in, so you can turn it or take it off and then put a towel over the top, because when something's really hot and you blend it and it's just like hot blending mixture in there, you can create a little mini explosion and you don't want to get burned. So make sure that you're being cautious here. I'm going to just put a towel over mine just to be extra safe. The blender is going out of control. It's spinning around. All right, let's see here. All right. So as you can see, that took a couple minutes to blend that up, and so it's pretty smooth. Let me show you what the texture is looking like here. So I have a really, really smooth sauce. I can run my finger through the tamper, and you can see that it holds that line. So it's a nice and thick sauce. And the other thing that I'm tasting for is salt, which I just tasted it. It definitely needs a little bit more salt. So let me give it a good taste. Definitely needs more salt, but it's almost there. So I'm going to give it like 2 more pinches of salt. I'll blend that until it's well incorporated, and then we have a nacho cheese that's ready to go. All right, let me go ahead and blend that. And then I'm also checking on my jackfruit just to make sure that I'm not burning it. And I'm going to hit it with a little bit more of oil and orange juice in just a moment after I blend this up. All I was just blending to see if I can get any more of those like little potato skins blended even further down. You can see that most of them are essentially gone. So again, just tasting for salt. And that is super good nacho cheese. So you can use this for mac and cheese. I also make roasted poblano mac and cheese. So you could fire roast some poblanos on the stove and take the seeds out. You can leave the skin on and throw those in with this cheese and blend it up until it turns a little bit green. And it's going to have this nice kind of smoky flavor from the fire roasting and the spiciness from the poblano. It's going to be so good. So nacho cheese is ready to go. I'm just going to set it aside. And then let me turn back to my jackfruit on the stove. And so I'm going to just get this pot out of the way. I didn't end up needing any more of my liquid. And I have here my jackfruit that is browning really nicely. Ooh, and even starting to blacken. So you can see here that I probably turned away for just a minute too long, but it's totally fine because once you start to kind of mix this up and distribute all the other jackfruit around, it's going to be perfectly fine. And I can see here that my jackfruit is starting to maybe not crisp up as much. It's maybe starting to just like blacken a little bit more. And so I want to hit it with a little bit more oil. Again, this is meant to be like carnitas, right? And so if you've never had carnitas before, it's a cultural dish that has been around for a long time. And it's essentially pork cooked in its own fat. So the dish is pretty oily. You know, it has quite a bit of fat in it. And because jackfruit is a fruit that doesn't have any fat in it, I want to make sure that I'm incorporating some of that throughout. And at this point, we've probably been cooking this jackfruit for about 20, maybe almost 25 minutes. So I'm starting to get to the point here where I'm feeling like it's getting pretty close to being done. And I'm just hitting it with the rest of that orange juice to give it that nice juiciness, that sweetness, the sugars that are going to help continue to brown it. And I'll cook this for a few more minutes. And this now starts to become your personal preference. So you may look at this and say, wow, this looks great. I'm ready to eat it. I love the jackfruit at this point. Or you might look at that and say, I want it to be a little bit more crispy. I personally love my jackfruit to be pretty crispy. So I'd probably keep playing with it or cooking it just a little while longer. I'm going to hit it with just a little bit more oil. And I can hear that sizzling as the oil hits because it's bringing up my temperature in the pan, in the skillet. So I'll just keep cooking this for another couple minutes before I transition to start to bring my dish together. And one other thing I want to talk about here that I haven't really touched on too much, and I'll go back to my computer to share a little bit about this, is just really thinking about culture and tradition and what everything means in terms of the foods that we see on our tables, depending on where our families are from. And carnitas is interesting because it has now become a dish that is so ingrained in Mexican culture, although technically pork is a ingredient that hasn't that was essentially introduced to Mexican culture and cuisine when colonization happened. So if you really think about like the true tradition and the true roots of our cultural foods, carnitas is not it. We didn't have carnitas prior to colonization. In fact, we didn't have pork, chicken, beef, eggs. We didn't have dairy. We didn't have oil. And so the cuisine was really quite different back then. And so I like to be able to create things that are resonating with where we are today, right? I like to meet people with where they are. If folks are interested in eating carnitas, well, best believe I'm going to pull out the jackfruit and try to meet them where they're at. But I also like to really think about what decolonizing our foodways looks like and really thinking about how our ancestors ate a mostly plant-forward diet that didn't depend on meat in the way that we see our cultural food now really relying on meat as the star. And we need to be able to kind of reframe what that means. So when people tell me, for example, oh, Jocelyn, the dishes that you have in here are great, but you're making jackfruit pozole. If your pozole doesn't have pork or chicken in it, it's not traditional, because I mean, that's an ancestral dish that has been around for a long, long time. And the truth of the matter is that pozole, for example, is something that has been around for a long, long time prior to colonization. So it was around a lot longer than before there was pork or chicken introduced into our diets. So it's important for us to think about like how our traditions continue to evolve and how we can kind of continue to adjust and tailor things and make them fit where we're at, yet thinking about what I consider to be like a health crisis. A lot of POC, a lot of low income, Black and Brown communities of color are struggling with preventable diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, thyroid disease. There's a lot of issues that we're dealing with, and a lot of it is based on the food that we eat. And we have to kind of reframe how we think about food as nourishing ourselves, as taking care of ourselves, as our resiliency and our connection to the land, versus just an experience that's like fun in the moment, but then it's really creating a strain on your health in the long run. So this is my pozole rojo that has jackfruit in it with organic yellow corn. So it's just a really easy, similar process here of cooking the jackfruit and then putting it in the pozole. I have pozole verde in here, and this is more of like a mushroom base. And all these recipes are in my book, La Vida Verde, including the one that we're making today, although this nacho picture includes chorizo over the top versus the jackfruit that we're having today. But chorizo is in the book as well, too. So I really wanted to be able to create all these nostalgic flavors that folks in the community are craving, so that it feels like it's still culturally relevant. And I've had also people tell me, hey, if you're trying to have people eat healthier, why are you offering agua fresca that's like sweetened with maple syrup? Like, why not give them green juices and green smoothies? And my response to that is, again, I'm trying to meet folks where they are. If folks in my community are addicted to soda, Coca-Cola, eating meat all the time, I have to build a bridge somewhere, right? I can't just be like, here's a wheatgrass drink that you likely will just not like at all. I need to be able to say, hey, here's something that's sweetened more naturally, that's using fresh fruits or vegetables. And let's slowly start that conversation and that process, which takes time, right? It's going to take generations to undo the harm that we have, have come to at this point, at this crossroad. So let me start to assemble my dish. I have here some totopos, some tortilla chips. You can, serve this in any way that you like. I just have a small little plate so I can give it a little try. And I'm going to come back here to my my cast iron, and you can see here that my jackfruit has definitely transformed. You have some nice browning that's happened. You can see that it generally has turned more of like this golden brown. And like I mentioned, I really like to crisp up my jackfruit. So you could already eat it at this point, but I'm gonna keep cooking it. I typically, as I'm cleaning up after class, I'll like put it all the way on the lowest setting on my stove, and I'll be cleaning as the jackfruit's still cooking on a very low heat so that it doesn't burn. I'm gonna taste it for salt, which I should have done earlier, and I didn't. I was distracted talking to all of you. I'm gonna add a little bit of more salt, mix that in, and my jackfruit is essentially ready to go. All right, so I'm just gonna grab a little bit of pico de gallo that I made before class that I have in the fridge. And we can come back to my cutting board here, and I'm just going to bring it all together. All right, so I have my small plate of chips here. Hopefully you can see that okay. And I'm gonna just simply pour my nacho cheese, which is still really hot, in the blender. And I'm going to just pour a little bit of nacho cheese. You can pour it back into the pot to keep it warm and just keep it on a really low heat. I'm just pouring that over my chips. That's so good. And then I'm gonna grab a little bit of my jackfruit. I'm gonna just grab some tongs and I'll put a little bit of jackfruit over the top. There we go, just like that. And then the last thing is just I made a little pico de gallo, and it's just tomato, avocado, lemon juice, cilantro, jalapeno, and a little bit of red cabbage. If you had radishes, you can definitely use radishes over the top. If you have frijoles de la olla, even better. You can definitely keep adding and adding to it. You can garnish with cilantro. All these things are just gonna give it more of a pop of color, a little bit of freshness, and then also just gonna make it so much more delicious. All right. So I have my nachos here. You can see I kind of went a little overboard. This is supposed to be a little snack before my actual dinner that I'm gonna have right after this. But this is our final dish. I will take a bite and we are gonna open it up to see if folks are doing all right, if there's any questions out there.
That looks so good. Oh my goodness.
It's so good.
Yeah, that looks delicious. So, I was going to ask you if that's your dinner.
It is my dinner, yeah.
That's
yeah.
awesome.
And the cheese is like perfectly coating the tortilla chip. And nachos is something you have to eat pretty quickly, right? Like, because then you get sogginess. But I've had soggy nachos, and it's still really good. But the jackfruit is definitely like, it has a slight crisp to it. I'm gonna keep crisping mine, and it just has like this nice depth of flavor to it. A nice meaty depth of flavor.
Oh man. Well, we have some questions for you. Let's see. It might be Errol or Carol has a question. What are some other ways to flavor the jackfruit carnitas?
That's a great question. So I was mentioning other ways that you can include other ingredients. Like you can add a little bit of liquid aminos, that liquid smoke that I mentioned. You can add a little bit of lemon juice to give it a bit of tartness. You can definitely just keep adding on those flavors. I mentioned earlier too, I really love to use like mushroom paste, mushroom powder to give it even more of a depth of flavor. So all these things are what we call umami, right? Like nutritional yeast, soy sauce, like Parmesan cheese, for example, is umami. Mushrooms are umami. Like so many things are umami. So like anything that you can add that's umami is going to make it taste even more delicious. Like you're going to keep, reaching for it because it's going to be so good.
I'm curious. Sorry. Well, where do you get mushroom paste or mushroom powder?
That's a great question. So I like to get mushroom powder. Actually, I went to a chef store today. It's called Surface here in LA, and they have porcini mushroom powder. But you can also go online and just find porcini mushroom powder and get it from a health food store or something like that. So you can find like shiitake powder, porcini powder, so many different powders, or you can also get like just whole dried. I think it might be like 2 out of reach. Actually, here it is. But I like to have just like dried mushrooms on hand, right? Yeah. And this is a store. It's called Surface. And this is a mix of oyster, chanterelle, shiitake, and wild mushrooms. And this is good for making broths, or if I'm making frijoles de la olla or rice. If you just throw a few in there, like it just kind of helps to develop the flavors even more.
Okay, that's great. We have another question. It's actually from our dean, Grant Linzel. What about leftovers? Does this keep well in the fridge?
That's a great question. So jackfruit keeps really well in the fridge. You can keep it in the fridge just marinated or seasoned, that's still raw. You can keep it in the fridge cooked, which I think is great because you can easily pull it out of your fridge, reheat it, maybe add a sauce to it from day to day. Like today you can eat it this way with nachos. Tomorrow you can maybe add a mole sauce or pipián sauce and really transform the dish. And it also freezes really well too. So you can definitely put it in containers based on the amounts that you would like to store. And then you can just quickly defrost it and heat it up. So it's really versatile. It's really easy to store. And the nacho cheese, actually, you can also refrigerate for about, I would say for like about 4 to 5 days or so. And you can also freeze it.
Okay. Does it get, you know how real cheese kind of gets a skin on it? Does it do that or?
It actually doesn't. It doesn't. It holds pretty well. So it doesn't get the weird skin thing.
That's good. It's a good I was curious because our campus is majority Latino, Latina, and I think that it's wonderful to have students and our community see their own culture reflected in a new way to re-envision it. Because I think going vegan seemed alienating to a lot of people because their culture, they didn't see their culture reflected in the foods that you see on like Food Network or things like that. So my question is, and I'm Asian, and a lot of like Japanese, we love pork. So I'm curious, how do you make decisions on what to retain outside of the obvious, like take away the meat part, but how do you kind of make these decisions on how to kind of keep that authentic flavor you talk about and what to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that for me, like, obviously I'm rooted in this culture, but in addition to that, I'm also very cognizant of and critical about the health issues and like all these things that are affecting our communities, and also lack of accessibility to healthy food, period. And so I want to be able to still keep the flavors, but thinking about like what is going to be more at the end of the day healthy for most people to eat, right? And I think that vegan could feel pretty alienating to a lot of people. In fact, that's why I wanted my book to be titled plant-based versus vegan, because there is a difference. Plant-based is a little bit more lenient. Like somebody could eat mostly plants, but from time to time, maybe they don't, but like they're plant-based, meaning like the majority of their diet is from plants, where vegan is a bit more strict. Vegan means no animal products consumed topically on your clothes, in your household. And so a lot of people think that that is too extreme for them, which is why I didn't want to have vegan anywhere in this book, because I want to, again, like meet folks where they are. If they really want to embrace some of the recipes that I have out there or in, specifically in this book, and they still eat meat from time to time. Like, for example, Mio, you were just saying like, you see pork, like you might be like, I can't give it up. I can't ever give it up. It's a part of my lifestyle. Right. But maybe I can get you to cook this way at home. And then maybe you only go out and eat that pork, once in a couple weeks or so. That for me is a huge win. I don't need you to be 100% plant-based or vegan for me to feel like that's a shift that's in a positive direction for your health, for the planet, for people and animal agriculture industries, like all around, right? And so I try my best to be more inviting versus doing this, right? You shouldn't do this, blah, blah, blah. Because I think that's what we see a lot in like the vegan community is like, oh, you're this, you're that, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to take any part of it. It's like, no, that's great. In fact, I've had people DM our Todo Verde account, and they're like hardcore vegans, and they're saying, you're following so-and-so, and they eat meat and whatever. I'm like, who are you?
Yeah.
Who are you? Like, this is insanity. Like everybody has the right to, choose what they want to eat. I'm just trying to encourage people in a positive, hopefully helpful way to consider what they're eating on a day-to-day basis a bit more.
Right. It's the outwoking syndrome where
Yeah.
outwoke each other.
Yeah.
Well, I really love having you here. I hope that you can come back one day because this is really different than anything we've done before. And I really appreciate your time. This is a stressful week, crazy
Yeah.
week. So I want to thank everybody who's watching right now, especially you, Jocelyn. There you can see at the bottom, we have a link to her cookbook, which is I Own That Cookbook. It's fabulous. And also your website, right? Is there anything else you'd like to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have online cooking classes that we've been doing since COVID began in March. And we have classes that are open to the public, meaning like, we'll have a schedule out there. Right now we have tamales, pozole, and I can't remember what the third one is, but we have 3 classes up right now. We're going to be adding way more classes to the schedule, especially for the month of December leading up to the holidays. And those, again, are community-based classes, but we also have private classes. So we know that a lot of folks are being really cautious about celebrating birthdays and holidays with friends and family in close quarters. And so some people are taking the virtual route. And we're doing cooking classes like this, maybe with slightly easier recipes where people in different households can be cooking the same dish and then going on to eat and celebrate together. And so that's another virtual offering that we have, are these private cooking parties, essentially.
Oh man, that sounds cool. That's perfect for right now, too.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's so much fun, too.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. We really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
I have one more announcement to make, and that is for Rio Hondo. So we're wrapping up our fall semester. Next week is our last cultural event for the fall semester. On November 12th, which is Thursday at 7 p.m., we have Genetic Wind Songs of Truth and Revolt, which is a performance and artist talk by Joe Galarza. He's an indigenous noise kind of experimental musician, and so it's gonna blow your mind. It's a real treat. All right, thank you so much, Jocelyn.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Enjoy,
Everybody,
everyone.
thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.